6th Art and Conversation seminar dedicated to synesthesia. Today we are discussing design and synesthesia, including product design. And we have three incredible speakers who will give their talks. And then, as usual, we'll have a Q&A session after their talks. Everyone will have a chance to ask a question or leave a comment during the discussion. So I'm going to present our first speaker. It's Dr. Michael Haverkamp, a consultant, lecturer, and author on cross-sensory design and acoustics. His PhD, obtained from the University of Mainz, was dedicated to physiological influences and perceptions of vibration. Dr. Haverkamp's professional interests involve product development, acoustics engineering, multisensory design, studies of cross-modal perception, arts, and music. Dr. Haverkamp developed methods for multisensory harmonization and product design at the Ford Development Center. He also applies multisensory principles for creation of visual arts and music. Dr. Haverkamp, we are very thankful you accepted our invitation, and I'm very happy just to please leave you the floor whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Marina, for the nice introduction, and many thanks to you and to Anton for inviting me to this interesting seminar, which I attended also last week with this very interesting topics regarding smell. So now we're dealing with industrial design, and I would like to give a short introduction and show some examples regarding multisensory design with common aspects versus multisensory design including synesthesia. So I try again to share my presentation. Total screen, and there I have, for me, I have this switch for the audio. Now I have to click on the screen and then I can share. That works. This is my presentation. So, synesthetic versus multisensory design. A longer time ago, I made up a taxonomy or a graphic which should show which different possibilities for the perceptual system roughly exist to connect content of the different senses. For example, we have different sense organs for different senses, we all know that. And with the visual stimulus, we normally get visual perception. But as synesthetes, we know that we can also get visual perception or imagination if we are dealing with an auditory stimulus. So there are the different possibilities or strategies of the perceptual system to connect the senses. And
I'm very sorry to interrupt, Michael. I'm sorry. Can just everyone else please mute yourselves? I think we have some issues with sound. If everyone else but Michael just mute themselves, then we'll have better sound. Thank you. Thank you. Please continue.
Do we have echoes?
It's good now. Thank you. Please go on.
Okay, very good. Thanks. So I made up a simple scheme which should include the basic strategies of the perceptual system, which we can use in configuration of the arts and multisensory arts and also multisensory design. And it includes the following 5 strategies from bottom to top: the genuine synesthesia, the individual types of synesthesia. I think we all know which provide specific colors and shapes. And so if we are hearing music or listening to a sound, I should start with the top. Sorry, the top is a mathematical physical correlation. This is just intentional correlation of some physical facts or intentional construction of algorithms which connect different attributes which are available for different senses. I will show some examples later. So the main part of this scheme is dealing with common strategies which are available for, I think, all people, all human beings, that consists of cross-sensory correspondences, iconic connections or say associations, and semantic content, symbol or metaphor. I will show some examples and images later. And the specific type of connection is the genuine synesthesia, where music or sound leads to fixed colors, shapes, and so on. So I will give some basic illustrations for that now. Just starting with the individual synesthesia, which I think is a focus in this seminar. And I will give as an example one project I did last year. And for arts, this is okay. For the design, we need to try to find connections between the individual types of synesthesia and common aspects, because we need to have acceptable results for a wide range of customers. So as an example, music visualization based on my personal synesthesia, I took a piece with 3 movements, a recorder and piano sonata by Johann Sebastian Bach, and painted 3 pictures according to the 3 movements of the piece. At first doing sketches, and you can see that the recorder, so the flute voice of flute melodies always lead to some lines which are red to yellow, some sort of spaghetti, whereas the piano leads to clusters of blue, gray, and white points. So I started to include that into a picture, but I cannot always draw such spaghettis. That would be a little boring. So now I try to make up a concept with which I could include this in a more artistic manner on the picture with the high density. That was the concept, high density, compressing a lot of those individual perceptions into a single picture. So I started to work in my small working place. So I painted 3 pictures, and at first I choose the frame, and then I included my individual forms with acrylic paint on the pages. And so the result finally consists of 3 pictures for the 3 movements: Allegro moderato, Siciliano, and again final Allegro. So this is based on my individual perception, and I think it's very much acceptable for an artistic project. And finally, this was performed in Alcalá la Real during the conference, Synaesthesia conference last year in Granada, with the help of Svetlana Rudenko. So we played those 3 movements, and the paintings were displayed in the back. So that is okay for artistic projects, but would not be sufficient for design, because that should be acceptable for a wide range of customers. In the arts projects, not everyone would agree in the yellow color maybe, but that doesn't matter, but it would matter if you want to sell a product. So just giving some illustrations about the other possibilities or strategies of the perceptual system to connect the senses. The very important one is cross-sensory correspondences. You can see the illustration here. There's a children's music instrument uses the correspondence of brightness or lightness of the color and height of tone pitch to make up this color scale. In the product design, especially in automobile industry, but also in all other industries which are selling products for daily usage, we come to long lists of features which have to be addressed and optimized. This is one example. You should not understand each line of this. It only summarizes some features which have to be harmonized between the visual, haptic, and auditory sense. So multisensory optimization includes cross-sensory fit of multisensory harmony of the overall design, as well as signal features, and should include part-to-part harmony, that this multisensory fit of a specific surface must also be applied for neighbored surfaces. There are some of those many parameters. This is just an excerpt. Some of the many parameters exist in all senses, which are addressed here. For example, the roughness. You can look at the surface, and the surface can look rough. And if you touch it, it may feel rough. It may fulfill your expectation or may not. And if you slide your fingers over the surface, you get a sound, and the sound has also a specific roughness, more or less. And in this example, you have to align or harmonize this visual roughness with the felt tactile roughness with the auditory roughness. So just an example. Another important strategic or bundle of strategies is dealing with the iconic or associative content. So this is here we have some examples of associative components of urban ambience, which are used for products also and advertisement. For example, make furniture look like a skyscraper, or use perfume bottles to make up a skyline, or add specific urban elements into urban design optimization. For example, this dropped cone, which is a little bit enlarged as an as an artistic work by Klaas Oldenburg, which adds specific components to the urban ambience. And it's also widely used for shop windows to provide a specific, urban atmosphere. This iconic features. The next one is very important also, semantic features and symbols. You have the symbols everywhere where you have where you have the need to operate technology. And it's also important not only to write information, but also to have tactile coding, that you can feel specific symbols and feel the operation or the function of a specific button. This is also important for blind people, for example, inside a lift. And you can also add signal lamps for this task. You can add branding aspects, for example, company names or product names. It's also important, can be symbols or logos or complete product names, which can be seen or can be touched, or you can also use auditory logos for that. Informative textures can also be tactile. Now you see a different combination of symbols and written language at a touch screen. And you can use specific exciting moments. It can generate some exciting moments if you use specific symbols in an unusual manner. For example, this note of exclamation for packaging. So this is the semantic region of symbols. And finally, this intentional configuration, mathematic physical connection, is simply, this physical connection is simply occurs in nature, we could say. For example, someone takes a metal plate and puts some fluid on it and excites the metal plate with some music, and then the fluid makes up ripples with specific shapes. And so you get some correlation of those shapes with the music in terms of an artistic project. This also applies for all structures which are exciting sound. For example, a brake disc which squeals has specific patterns which are correlated with the generated sound. Was there any comment?
No,
Okay.
Please continue.
Okay. So some older concepts to align, correlate music or musical tones with colors are made up with reference to the frequency of light correlated to the frequency of tones. You can see some examples, historical examples by Wallace Remington, who I think built up one of the first light organs, and he wanted to systematically correlate the tones of a chromatic scale with the scale of colors, and he proposed several concepts for this. But in fact, if you're dealing with a combination of tone and colors, there are differences, because if you're combining different colors, visual colors on a sheet of paper, then if you add more and more colors, it will more and more become gray and less colorful. Or if you have different colored lights and you overlap those lights, then this will more and more be pale and will not be more interesting as it is in music, where chords are more interesting than single notes and more, let's say, colorful than single notes. So those are some images to illustrate the different strategies. Yes, this is the last example by Alexander Laszlo, which shows how complicated a simple concept can be and how abstract and not plausible, because he has some discs and you can rotate one disc towards the other disc, and you can choose for a specific musical interval. For example, a third is shown. You can choose then different, or you will get some different color combinations. And in this case, you can see this. In case of the third, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8 different color combinations, which look quite different. So a simple concept can be very complicated, but in fact, those concepts are widely used, for example, to program algorithms which connect the music signal with visuals and so on. So now some examples. At first, one example for pure multisensory sound design for a slide bar. And just to show that it makes sense or is important to add different methods and different correspondences into one design of a quite simple sound. I hope you can hear this. This is a slide bar. You can move on the touch screen the slide bar down and up again. And this should be correspondent with a mapping of a sound, and the sound should be very much aligned to this visual task and this what is happening on the screen. So I hope you can hear the sound. If I move the slide bar down, the sound is like this. Can you hear that?
Yes.
Okay, I do it again. One moment. Okay. So this is dealing with all the common ways of strategies which can be included there in parallel. Moving upwards is inverse. And so the different strategies are, I did not want to have a random sound, an electronic random sound. I wanted to have a natural sound. So I used this calabash rattle sliding across the surface of this rattle gives a more natural, authentic sound. So this is application of iconicity. Then I applied a medium loudness. The loudness or the intensity of stimuli must very much be aligned between the senses according to the function you want to have. I did not want to grasp too much attention with the sound, so it should be a little bit weak but audible. Then the correspondence of sound and movement is used. Of course, synchronicity of sound and vision must be the case. I hope this is the case with this internet transmission. Maybe not, but in the practice, it must be exactly synchron. Should show synchronicity. And the sound should be localized in the direction where the vision is or where the symbol is moved. That is very important, but sometimes not easy to achieve. And of course, one of the main correspondences used here is the correspondence pitch to height, audible pitch to visual height. And I also included musical semantics, meaning that the pitch up and down includes exactly 7 semitones, a musical fifth, and this gives you the impression or the feeling that you are approaching somewhere if you're reaching the end of the line. So you can see that in multisensory design, you can use various strategies or methods which work in the perceptual system just to provide a design that is really plausible and understandable in daily life. So now I would like to add two examples where genuine synesthesia is added to those plausible designs or plausible connections of the senses. The first I have already presented in Moscow some years ago. A combination, at first in principle, a combination of cross-sensory and genuine synesthetic features is applicable wherever vision, sound, and haptic interact with each other. One example I want to show here is regarding the design of switches and door handles. You know, if you apply a door handle that makes a characteristic click or clack clack noise, and you can also feel some vibration, so you are convinced that the locking mechanism works. So, and the idea here was to add visual aspects of this sound also to the design of the door handle. And that could look like that. So specific different sounding locking mechanisms can be supported by specific designs of the door handle. What we have in most cases in technology is the connection of low and loud frequency, low frequency noise, loud noises connected to big switch, or weak and high frequency clicks connected to small switches or buttons. Another example could be if we're dealing with classical writing tools. We all know that that writing with those writing tools provides some sound, and this sound gives information about the function of the writing tool, the material of the pen, and the material on which we are writing. For example, we all know this characteristic ballpoint pen sound when writing, which is dependent on the pressing force, motion, the effect whether the ball is rolling or not. If it's not rolling, you cannot produce a line, and so it gives information whether it all works or not. And you feel some vibration and sound. Sound may sound like this. And one proposal includes the fact that those different sounds also can induce different types of visual synesthesia, that we can probably add the visual synesthesia as decorative elements to the pen, and we can also indicate the type of pen with this pattern. And one proposal is like this. So the thick and rough pen is differently marked, and fine, hard, and squeaky material for the pen shows a different visual pattern. So that should just indicate that we should need both for a plausible design, common features, and then we can also add our specific feelings. If we base the design exclusively only on our individual feelings, that may be difficult to find a wider group of customers who would be interesting. But in this manner, genuine synesthesia is very helpful, adds interesting aspects and more excitement. Thank you very much for your attention.
Michael, thank you very much. It's such an important talk, and really, surprising how elemental may be some of the synesthetic experiences and how they can contribute to general design. And our questions will be later, but now let me introduce Leighton Shams. Dr. Leighton Shams is a professor of psychology, bioengineering, and neuroscience at the University of California, Los Angeles. She is also head of the UCLA Multisensory Perception Laboratory. Dr. Shams is a researcher in the field of visual, auditory, and tactile perception, attention, and perception learning, and also multisensory integration. Her research has been funded by National Science Foundation, National Institute for Health, and the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. Dr. Shams has published numerous articles and book chapters and is herself an associate editor of several world-leading neuroscience journals. Dr. Shams is a member of the National Science Foundation College for Overviewers, the Society for Neuroscience, the Vision Sciences Society, and the International Multisensory Research Forum. She was featured by Chronicle of Higher Education as one of the 5 scholars to watch, and is frequently consulted as an expert by media outlets such as NPR, BBC, and CNN. Dr. Shams, I'm privileged to introduce you. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Anton. Thanks for inviting me. I'm going to try and tackle 3 of the questions that were posed by the organizers that relate more to my research. They are: which cross-modal aspects determine aesthetic experience and perceptual pleasure? What brain mechanisms or multisensory processing should be taken into account by design practitioners? And what is the pragmatic value of studying cross-modal illusions? The first 2 questions are interrelated, and they are kind of addressed by a recent study we did in my lab a few years ago. And I'm going to start with that. So if we could advance to the next slide. Okay. So looking at these 2 pictures, I'm sure we all have a preference for one of the pictures over the other one. And this preference cannot be due to perceptual characteristics of these 2 pictures, because they are perceptually very similar. We see more or less the same colors, the same patterns, the same shapes, the same texture. Perceptually, these 2 pictures are very similar, and yet we have a strong preference for one over the other one. And that is because of the understanding of the content of the picture and what the knowledge we have about the individuals that are depicted and what they're associated with, that drives our preference. But if you look at pictures that are shown in the next slide, like these, some landscapes, one person may prefer one over the other one, another person may prefer the opposite. And here, if we have a preference, or if we listen to pieces of music, if we can advance to the next, yes, if we listen to 2 novel pieces of music we have never heard before, let's go back. Yes, thank you. Then the preference that we may have for one piece of music over another one, or one landscape over another one, is at least partly due to the perceptual characteristics of these stimuli. And that could have to do with, again, the quality of the low-level characteristics of the sounds or visual stimuli. So this is what we call perceptual pleasure, which is understanding the study of perceptual pleasure tries to shed light on the stimulus characteristics that shape our preferences. And this field has focused primarily on visual stimuli. There have been a lot of studies that have tried to understand what characteristics of images influence our preferences. And there have been some studies of auditory perceptual pleasure, very few studies of tactile perceptual pleasure. But in all cases, the studies have primarily focused on one sense in isolation. But our experience in the world is always multisensory. Even if you go to a sensory deprivation chamber, there are still multiple senses that are activated. So then it's a reasonable question to ask whether the preferences that we have, the experience of pleasure, in multisensory settings it goes above and beyond the factors and unisensory components that influence preferences. So that's the multisensory perceptual pleasure that hasn't been studied as much, and we have started looking into that. To address multisensory perceptual pleasure, we use video clips. And if we can advance to the next slide. So I'm going to show you a demo that I hope it works. And I'm going to show you 2 video clips. And I would like you to, after watching each of these clips, to give a rating from -100 to +100, with -100 denoting very unpleasant and +100 representing very pleasant and 0 being neutral. And you don't have to tell me, you can just remember or write it down so you don't forget. And do this after each of the 2 videos, and then I'm going to ask you to answer a question. So the first video, let's advance to the next slide. So this is the first video. Okay. Okay, great. It worked. There may be some choppiness because of Teams, but you got the idea. So please remember your rating from -100 to +100 for this. And then we go to the next video clip. Yes, there we go. Thank you. So this was the second one. Please give it a rating. Now, how many people felt that these 2 videos were identical? Raise your hand. Okay, nobody. Okay, I'm surprised. Well, how many people gave a higher rating to the first video?
I prefer the first one.
Okay, so yeah, this may not work very well over, remote presentation, but the vast majority of people would prefer the first video over the second one, as we see also a lot of people here. And the thing is that the 2 videos were indeed identical, and the 2 audios were also identical. What was different between these 2 video clips was the relationship between the video and audio. So if we could go to the next slide, you can see that the video on the top row shows the alignment of the musical notes in the soundtrack with the cuts in the video, and the first beat of each measure, which is the emphasized beat in the music, was basically aligned with the cut in the videos in the first clip that you observed. And in the second one, they were not aligned, they were misaligned. That was the only difference between the two video clips. And even though it's a really subtle change and we are not consciously aware of it, even as people who designed it, sometimes I had a hard time telling the difference. But this did make a big difference in the ratings of the videos in the experiment. If we can go to the next slide. We saw that the subjects rated the congruent or aligned videos much higher than the misaligned videos. And we did another experiment where in this experiment, the two conditions were not presented to the same subject, they were presented between groups. And we did another experiment where we had a within subject design, and that increased the experimental power. So we needed fewer subjects and we get the same results. And interestingly, in both of these experiments, even though we had a large sample size, none of the subjects, except for one subject who had extensive experience in video editing, none of the subjects noticed the manipulation or could tell what the difference between these videos were. So in the next slide, I summarize that the congruency between auditory and visual stimuli is preferred by individuals, even when it's subliminal, even when we have no conscious access to the relationship between the two modalities. So if there's no question on this, I now switch to the second part of the presentation and try to tackle the question of the usefulness or the utility of cross-modal illusions. Unlike the perceptual pleasure, which is a relatively new topic of research in my lab, the question of cross-modal illusions is something we have been working on for decades. So we have a lot of experience with cross-modal illusions, a wide range of illusions. So I can talk for hours about that, but here I use one illusion as an example to make my points. And that in the next slide, before I show you this illusion, let me ask a question. How many of you feel that the visual modality is the dominant sensory modality in humans? Raise your hand. Okay. So for those of you who raise your hands, and all I see 4 people, you're not alone. This is studies, actually, this has been asked. Some people have done studies on this, and the studies show that majority of people feel vision is a dominant modality for them. And it's not just lay people. Perception scientists also for a long time believe that vision is a dominant sensory modality in humans. So here I'm going to show you this demo, and the red dot that you see on the screen is the fixation point. So please keep your eyes fixated on the red dot, and then we're going to show you actually if Marina, if you, instead of clicking on the screen, because then it shows that annoying video play sign, if instead of clicking on that, if you just press arrow key on your keyboard, yeah, let's not do it yet, but yeah, but that would basically activate the video.
I'll try.
Yeah, without showing that bar, which would interfere with the visual stimulus. So I don't know why PowerPoint does that. I have to figure out how to fix that. But so what you're going to see is Marina is going to show a stimulus on the lower left part of the screen, and then another stimulus on the lower right part of the screen. And while you keep your eyes on the red dot, you want to pay attention to these parts of the screen to see if you notice a difference between the two. Okay, so Marina, if you could, without clicking, just press a button on your screen, on your keyboard.
I'm trying, but not sure.
Yes.
Oops, if it's
It
working.
doesn't work. The down arrow. Oh, the sound worked. Okay. Yeah, the sound is working, but the flash is not showing. Okay, so that's not our that's not our fault. That's the fault of Teams because the remote, the stimulus. Yeah, because the stimulus is so brief. It's just one frame. Sometimes this demo doesn't work remotely. I'm sorry about that. So you need to basically take my word for it. We're going to skip this demo, unfortunately, and move on to the next slide. So you need to take my word for it that when the flash appears on the screen, a black disk appears on the screen, when it is appearing with no sound or with just one beep, we perceive it as one flash, no problem, very clear percept of a single flash. But when it appears together, when it's accompanied with two beeps, then we perceive two flashes. So the pairing with two beeps turns our very clear perception of one flash into two flashes. So this is what we call the sound-induced flash illusion. And it's a very robust illusion, and we and many other labs have studied it very extensively. But what this shows is that sound can qualitatively alter the visual perception. And a lot of studies, both by my lab and many other labs, have shown that the interaction between the visual and auditory modalities, at least in this case, starts at very early stages of perceptual processing. So this illusion, and like many other cosmol illusions, have basically helped us get an understanding about the nature of the cosmol interactions in the brain. And basically this illusion helped us debunk the long-standing view that vision is a dominant sensory modality in humans. So is this just limited to this particular task and particular combination of modalities, or is this a more general phenomenon? We asked that question, so we extended this to three modalities: vision, hearing, and touch. And we presented, if we can advance to the next slide, we presented a combination of flashes, beeps, and taps on the finger in a variety of trials, some unisensory trials, some bisensory trials, and some trisensory trials. Some trials were congruent, some trials were incongruent. And what we found was that in every condition where there was any discrepancy between two or three modalities, we observed an illusion. And because in this experiment, the discrepancies between the modalities was limited, it was not very large. So this basically shows that there's nothing special about the sound-induced flash illusion. These interactions between the modalities are the rule rather than the exception. And we have also used this illusion as well as other illusions to explore the computational principles that govern these interactions. So if we can advance to the next slide, I summarize that the findings show that there is no sensory modality in humans or other animals that is categorically the dominant sensory modality. And the interactions between the modalities closely follows Bayesian causal inference, which is a computational model that we and others have shown explains a lot of almost every multisensory phenomena that we have looked at. So let's move to the next slide. So in summary, we have seen, and this is very nicely summarized in a review paper published by Hurst et al. A couple of years ago, that summarized more than 100 papers that have used the sound-induced flash illusion in the studies. And it shows that this again, as an example of cross-modal illusion, is a very useful tool to shed light. If we could advance to the next bullet here, yeah, shed light on the computational principles that govern perception. Also, the next bullet, the underlying neural mechanisms that are involved in processing sensory information. And next bullet, a very useful tool to study development, to study aging, next bullet, and to study clinical conditions. So all of these things can benefit from use of cross-modal illusions. In this case, we're using sound-induced flash illusion as an example. So cross-modal illusions are very useful for a variety of reasons in the scientific study of perception. And I'm going to end with this, with the next slide showing my collaborators and my my sponsors. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was an incredibly rich and interesting presentation. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions during the discussion. Thank you very much again. Okay, so it's time for me now to present our third speaker. It's Nicholas Rothen, a professor of psychology at Unidistance Switzerland. He is interested in factors with a strong potential to enhance memory. Professor Rothen's research is focused on synesthetic experiences to investigate how individual differences in visual perception affect memory performance. He empirically investigates how perceptual phenomenology is shaped and how synesthetic experience is developed. In his research, Professor often uses different methods, including laboratory and internet-based data acquisition, psychophysiology, neurophysiology, including EEG, non-invasive brain stimulation, and computational modeling. Thank you very much, Dr. Rothen, for accepting our invitation. We are thrilled to host you today, and please feel free to begin your presentation whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, and can I just ask everyone again, please mute your microphones so that we have a better quality of sound. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to start. So I'd also like to talk about design in synesthesia and from a memory researcher perspective in this case. So let me advance with a little bit of information. So when I talk about synesthesia, I essentially mean grapheme color synesthesia, and this is basically a case because this is the best studied form of synesthesia. So I'm just gonna abbreviate and talk about synesthesia in general. If I don't specify further, this basically relates to grapheme color synesthesia. First of all, I'd like to address the question which cross-modal aspects determine hedonic aesthetic experience and perceptual pleasure. And here I'd like to refer to a study that was conducted a few years ago and used stimuli like the one that I'm presenting here on the screen from an audiovisual animation called An Eye Full of Sound, which was created by Samantha Moore. And these stimuli were presented to non-synesthetes, and they had to rate how much they liked these stimuli. And what was found was that synesthetic art was liked more by non-synesthetes in comparison to non-synesthetic art. So the control stimuli that were used in this study were essentially the same stimuli, but either rotated or with different colors. So that means the message that I want to bring across on this slide is that there are some aspects of cross-modal mappings which are inherent to synesthesia, and they seem to, at least in part, determine the hedonic aesthetic experience and perceptual pleasure. So the question now is, why is this the case? And here I would like to refer to another study that was conducted by Simner and colleagues, also quite a few years ago. And what they did is they were looking into the specific associations of grapheme color associations in synesthesia. And what they found was that even though synesthetic associations are usually quite idiosyncratic, there are nevertheless underlying patterns. So I don't know whether you can actually see my drawings on the screen, but what has been found, for instance, is that specific letters, that they actually go together with specific colors beyond what we would expect just purely on coincidence. For instance, A and R tend to go together with red, Y with yellow, for instance, B with blue, O with white. Even more interestingly, when non-synesthetes were forced to choose colors for letters, even though they don't have any color experiences, they tended to select the same associations for quite a lot of letters. For instance, AR, red, as is the case with synesthetes, blue for B, as is also the case for synesthetes, and Y, as is also the case for synesthetes. So this tells us that there seems to be some implicit, at least non-random associations that are more general than just related to synesthetic experiences. And based on the mere exposure effect that we do know from memory, which essentially states the more we are exposed to something, the more we like it, we can assume that a consequence here is, because everyone has this implicit exposure to non-random associations, that we like arts created by synesthetes more than arts based on mappings contradicting synesthetic associations, basically because we all have experience and are familiar with these specific mappings. Essentially, since everyone seems to share similar associations, it seems to make absolute sense that the aspects of cross-modal mappings inherent to synesthetic experiences seem to determine hedonic aesthetic experience and perceptual pleasure. Then I'd like to go on with the next question, namely what traits and properties are empirically evidenced important features of congenital synesthesia and also its associated profile and cognitive style. I think one of the most important features related to congenital synesthesia are obviously the diagnostic traits associated with synesthesia. So we all know synesthesia is idiosyncratic. That means even though there are some non-random patterns across across many different synesthetes, it's also the case that for some synesthetes, for instance, an A is associated with yellow, whereas for other synesthetes, A is associated with red. It's also highly specific, the associations, in the sense that yellow is not just yellow, but A might be associated with one specific yellow, and E with another tone of yellow, the number 1 again with another tone of yellow, and so on. Moreover, synesthesia is also automatically triggered. For instance, if one synesthete associates an A with a red color experience, if they're presented with a red A and have to indicate the actual color of the letter, they're usually faster in comparison to when they're presented with an A that is incongruent to their synesthetic color. And then furthermore, it's not directly a diagnostic criterion, but because we don't usually test for that, but we also know that synesthesia has a specific neuroanatomical basis. So the questions now are, what are the implications of these findings? And when we look at one of the most influential models of visual perception, there we see that there is a dorsal pathway here indicated in green, which is associated with motion perception, processing of low contrast stimuli, low spatial frequency information, and spatial attention. And there is a ventral visual pathway, which is associated with processing color information, high contrast information, high spatial frequency information, and also object recognition. The interesting thing here is that across multiple different studies in the domain of synesthesia research, what has been found is that synesthetes seem to have an advantage processing color information, high contrast information, and high spatial frequency information. However, they don't seem to have an advantage in comparison to non-synesthetes when it comes to processing motion information, low contrast information, and low spatial frequency information. Even more interestingly, when we go into the field of memory research, and here we do find that synesthetic experiences are also related to enhanced memory performance associated with stimuli that bias processing towards the ventral visual pathway, even though the stimuli don't necessarily elicit synesthetic experiences, such as, for instance, abstract fractal patterns, which of course are of high spatial frequency and high contrast, or abstract patterns, then pattern color associations or color recognition. In comparison to that, synesthetes don't seem to have a memory advantage for stimuli that bias processing towards the dorsal visual stream, such as, for instance, remembering the location of abstract shapes in a spatial grid, or even remembering the location of digits in a matrix. So the implication of this is we can at least conclude from this that there are some strong links between perception and memory from a healthy human perspective. And this is something that has been termed the enhanced processing account of synesthesia. So the other question that I would like to address here in this talk is, how can synesthesia be induced in non-synesthetes, and to what extent can synesthesia be induced or trained? So with various different collaborators, I also conducted a few training studies, and our training studies ranged from like a training duration of 7 days, 10 minutes per day, to training durations of a total of 9 weeks, where participants trained for an hour per day. We used tasks like the delayed matching to sample task. So here you see an example. Participants would be presented with a sequence of letters, and they had specific associations they had to learn. So they already learned them in this case. For instance, Q was associated with a light green color, R with a blue color, B with a violet color. These dashed lines were not shown to the participants. The participants only saw the letters in a specific sequence, but were then presented with a color palette and had to indicate the order of the letters presented, but by choosing the colors that were associated with the specific letters. And obviously you can make these tasks adaptive in the sense that the better the participants learn the associations, the more difficult tasks become, in the sense that you could increase the length of the sequence. Here are only 3 letters, but you could present 4 letters, 5 letters, or 6 letters even. So there is that we can induce features of genuine synesthesia. For instance, automaticity and consistency. That's 2 features which require the least amount of training to be induced, but also phenomenology and neurophysiological consequences. However, phenomenology and neurophysiology require the largest amount of training. Here's just an example from one of our studies where we used transcranial magnetic stimulation over the primary visual cortex to induce phosphines. That's when you stimulate the primary visual cortex with magnetic impulses, participants report flashes of light. And what is found in genuine synesthetes is that the stimulation threshold is reduced. And that's also exactly what we find here after the training, namely that the stimulation threshold is reduced in comparison to before the training. Whereas the motor threshold, when you apply the magnetic impulse to the primary motor cortex, isn't changed as a function of training. And that's also the case in actual synesthetes, namely they don't show a difference in the motor threshold in comparison to non-synesthetic controls. So that means with our training, we can actually change the phenomenological, neurophysiological basis of our participants. Although we also have to say that the synesthetic experiences, they tend to disappear if the training is discontinued. Okay, let's go on with one of the last questions that I'd like to respond to, namely, how can the relatively larger number of synesthetes among art students be explained? And here I think this is mostly a matter of cognitive style as well. Essentially, basically also because we know that synesthesia is mostly based on cultural artifacts. And in order to have a consistent experience for a specific letter, for instance, the letter A, the letter needs to be recognized as such. So if you don't know that an A is an A, you cannot have a consistent experience that is associated with A. That means in synesthetic experiences, there is also some sort of learning component involved, besides maybe a genetic component. And we did one study to test how synesthetic consistency could develop. And there we trained two different groups. One group did a consistency test on a daily basis for 9 days in total. And they were instructed to select colors for individual inducers based on their gut feeling. And were also instructed to try and remember these associations so that they would always select the same color. That's the explicit group. And as you can see, they become more and more consistent over time, and they reach the peak of consistency quite quickly. The implicit group, they actually had exactly the same task, but they were not told to try and memorize the associations. They were just told to select colors for letters and just do that on the basis of their gut feeling. And as you can see, they also reach the same level of consistency over time, even though they didn't try to memorize. So we can say that synesthesia might be some sort of cognitive style, maybe in terms of a default mode of thinking that is also linked to to something we have evidence that synesthetic consistency might develop over time. Then the question is also what this means in terms of expertise, because we could also regard synesthesia as some sort of expertise, because if you have a specific cognitive style, you basically engage with this on a daily basis and you develop some sort of expertise as well. And with that, we also conducted a study to show to investigate the influence of expertise. Here, I'm going to zoom in a little bit, basically because it's difficult to see. But we tested grapheme color synesthetes, color experts, so people who engaged with colors on a daily basis, but who were not synesthetes, and then non-synesthetic controls who also didn't have synesthetic experiences and no expertise with color, essentially. So what we found here, and that's a spatial contrast sensitivity task that we conducted, what we found here is essentially that synesthetes and experts share a more similar profile than, for instance, controls and experts or controls and synesthetes. So across different parameters, the synesthetes and the experts, they look much more alike. We also conducted a few memory tasks with these groups, and what we found there was also that the synesthetes and the experts were more alike in comparison to the controls. So it seems to be then a legitimate question to ask which came first. Is it the specific cognitive style or is it the synesthesia? And well, I mean, we also know that synesthesia can be induced by means of training. So if a specific style of thinking is cultivated, then synesthesia might actually be the consequence of that specific cognitive style. At the same time, we also know that maybe people with a specific cognitive style might be attracted to engage with arts. So the question really is, does a cognitive style, how it is developed maybe also in art students or in specific arts programs might lead to some sort of synesthetic thinking, but it might also be the other way around. The people who engage in a specific cognitive style, which is related to synesthetic thinking, is then they're also more attracted to studying arts. So I would like to conclude with the very last question. I mean, how would you characterize and evaluate the perceptual facets in modern day design trends? And as a memory researcher, I thought I can only say, well, I don't know. But then on the basis of what I just presented, I would probably conclude that the perceptual facets of modern day design trends are probably most likely based on expertise derived from implicit cross-modal associations, which are most explicitly expressed in genuine synesthesia. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm open to questions.
Incredible. Thank you very much. That was so very interesting. Yes, we are now ready to begin the discussion. And just for everyone, if you have a question, you can either type it in a chat or you can raise your hand and I'll give you the floor to ask a question. And we usually begin the discussion by giving an opportunity to our speakers to ask a question or comment on each other talks. So Michael, Nicholas and Ladan, please feel free to begin. Thank you.
Thank you for a great talk. Very interesting. I had a bunch of questions, but I forgot. So let me just start with this one. The TMS results you mentioned are very intriguing. Why should that be? Why should synesthetes have lower threshold for phosphines than non-synesthetes? What do you make of that?
Well, the idea there actually is that they have already some sort of increased activity in the primary visual cortex. And also what goes along with this is an associated profile of enhanced visual perceptual ability. For instance, grapheme color synesthetes, they are better at distinguishing very fine-grained differences between colors, but they're also they seem to have enhanced sensitivity as measured in terms of ERPs related to high contrast stimuli or high spatial frequency stimuli in comparison to non-synesthetic controls. And given this increased sensitivity, it seems to be easier to elicit phosphines in their primary visual cortex by means of transcranial magnetic stimulation.
Thank you.
Great, Michael, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, I have a question for Adam. And interesting, this experiment with the synchronicity of the cuts in the video stream, or the with the music, synchronicity or not synchronicity with the music. The question is, what would happen if you would continue it for a longer time, not do a short test with it, but take 10 minutes or 50 minutes? Because what you observe in video clips is that they sometimes using such synchronicity, yeah, of accents in music with cuts in the video stream, but not consequently. And I believe the reason must or the reason is that if you do it over a longer time, it's not pleasure, it's boring. It changes from pleasure to boring things because it's so monotonous. And that reminds me to our design questions. We wanted to harmonize between the senses, the product features, for example, in the interior of the car. And if you do it, it's very good. People like it. It's more pleasure, as you said. But if you only harmonize everything, then it's boring. And so our approach was to include a little bit a sort of incongruency just to make it more exciting, or to have some not expected elements included. That did you, coming back to the question, are you aware of tests about tests where they did it for a longer time?
Yeah, thank you for this point. It's an excellent point. In our experiments, the video clips were always very short, so we couldn't look into that. but I am aware, and actually somebody else had raised the same point. I could totally see that it would get boring, and after a while, you want to spice things up. So the question is, what is that sweet spot? And if this is something like an inverted U-shape function, that initially congruency is good, but then when you become too familiar, it becomes too fluent in processing, then it becomes less pleasant. And then if you introduce too much incongruency, it's also unpleasant. So there is a sweet spot I could imagine that would be consistent with a lot of other findings in perceptual pleasure, the inverted U-shape function. We haven't looked at that, and I'm not aware of anybody who has looked at this in terms of videos, but I completely agree with your point.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Nicholas and Anton, you have questions. Nicholas, do you want to go first? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I also have a question related to the videos, and I was wondering whether it actually makes a difference if participants think that the videos are actually identical or not, in terms of whether they like it or not. Does it only work with participants who think that they're identical, or does it also work if they actually notice that there is something different?
We did not. So in the first experiment, we showed some aligned and some misaligned videos to each subject, but we didn't show the exact videos in the two conditions to the same subject. So we didn't have a within subject comparison. In the second experiment we did, we showed the same video one time in aligned, one time misaligned condition, but we did across two sessions, and the sessions I think were 1 week apart. So the idea was that we wanted to minimize the effect of familiarity, because familiarity is a big factor in determining perceptual pleasure. We didn't ask the subjects to report whether they noticed that videos were identical or not. We did ask them if they noticed any pattern, and they didn't report any patterns. So that's why we believe it's subliminal. Are you expecting that? What is your hypothesis? Do you think that if somebody feels the videos are the same, but then if they feel that they're identical, they would give them the same rating, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I think I could imagine that. I mean, as soon as they realize that it's different, I think the effect might be stronger, or just completely random. Some might then say, okay, it's the first one. Others might say it's the second one. Whereas if it's only happening on an implicit basis, then you see the effect emerging. So that's why I was interested in that, because I could very well imagine that it completely disappears and that it just becomes random if they are aware of the fact that there is something different.
Right. So we couldn't gather that information in the experiments, but in the demos I have given to audiences, most people feel that the videos are the same. They can't put their finger on why they liked one better than the other one, but a lot of people felt that the videos, this is anecdotal because it's just in presentations. So I agree that even implicitly, if you feel that they're the same, the effect is still there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to briefly say that I was the one who was turning the video on, so I felt they are so similar. I probably made a mistake and turned on the first video again, and then I felt that I don't like that second video, and that made me think that probably it's a different video. Okay, Anton, please go on with your question.
Yeah, it's a question to Nicholas and probably to Mihail. It's about the similarity of trained synesthesia and genuine synesthesia. And I had myself a small experiment with what I call the 8th day of the week, with synesthetes who experience the colored day of the week type. And I trained with them an 8th day of the week. Well, it was an imaginary day of the week between Thursday and Friday. And it was like a very short session of 15 minutes with tasks and a short fiction story until you embed this 8th day of the week into their imagination and perception. And the result was that with eight people with synesthesia, this 8th day of the week produced a very unexpected color. So my conclusion was that there is no association. Synesthesia is essentially endogenous. And this is easily generalizable upon synesthetes who learn new foreign languages and new foreign alphabets, and they just have no time to have so multiple associations with all the letters that they learn. So, well, actually, in endogeneity, this endogenous genesis or endogenous generation of colors are deeply ingrained and probably depend on some other factors in synesthesia. And then we go back to the trained type of synesthesia. And how do you reconcile, Nicholas, these kind of similar, but probably not very similar experiences between trained synesthesia and genuine synesthesia?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily claim that we can create genuine synesthetes by means of this training procedure, but then on the other hand, we also had some sort of guided interviews where they had to report their phenomenological experiences, and we showed them letters printed in black on white pages. And I personally, I mean, I have to admit, I was very skeptical for a long time. I actually didn't believe that something like inducing synesthetic phenomenology would be possible. But then after the first study that we conducted during my time as a postdoc at the University of Sussex, and then all of a sudden someone would report synesthetic phenomenology after 5 weeks into the training, it was very clear that we also had to do a follow-up where we would assess the neurophysiological basis. But even now, I mean, I would still say, even though we are not able to tell trained synesthetes apart from genuine synesthetes just purely on what they're describing and on the basis of the neurophysiological observations, I wouldn't necessarily say this is exactly the same thing. And well, I mean, that's probably all I can say to this. But I think genuine synesthesia is something really different. Nevertheless, we can mimic almost all the features that we know so far in non-synesthetes when they're just trained for long enough.
I just wanted to add.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Anton, I cannot explain this why synesthetes immediately develop another elements or phenomena for an unknown day or due day of the week. That is interesting, but in this context, I also find interesting. I don't have an answer on that. Why many synesthetes with color grapheme synesthesia do not necessarily have colors for all the characters. Many synesthetes tell you that there are some characters, numbers or so, which do not have any color at all. That's also an interesting question. I have no answer.
Can we also deduce, and probably it's along the lines of Jamie Ward's research, that some synesthetes may not have synesthesia at all, and it's just like predisposition, very deeply rooted, but with no explicit manifestation. And during your training, you've just explicated this. You would just pull it out of them. And this is kind of a part of proof. There might be some more synesthetes among us, but we just hook on their predispositions.
I guess this might very well be the case. I mean, I personally do favor some sort of threshold model where we say there is a genetic predisposition. We all share common cross-modal associations, and then the threshold basically relates to how much training you need in order to turn someone into a synesthete. And obviously the level of the predisposition might actually shift the threshold as well. But it's just speculation. I mean, it's not something that we would have ever tested empirically so far.
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Aladdin, do you want to add something on that, please?
Yeah, I have a follow-up question. The fact that you can induce phenomenology in some of the subjects is really fascinating, but it's not inconsistent. There is an old paper, really old, where they did also induce it. I don't remember the author's name by heart, but I can find it and email it to you later. And they did extensive training, and eventually the phenomenology came about. But for those subjects that you could induce the phenomenology, did you observe a qualitative difference in the memory improvement or any of the is there a functional advantage to having the phenomenology?
Well, I mean, we only tried once, or we only tested once memory after a training study, and we had, unfortunately, or maybe it's also good that we did so. We had 2 different memory tasks, and now the problem is the results were very mixed. In one memory task, the participants indeed improved, and in the other memory task, they didn't. And the difference between the memory tasks was both of the tasks were a recognition task. One was with abstract fractals, and the other one was with words. And usually, what is found with genuine synesthetes, or what is found with genuine synesthetes, is that they do have stronger or greater memory advantages with abstract fractal patterns. So it kind of makes sense that we observe this for that specific memory task, but then still the evidence is very mixed. The effects were super small. I mean, I'm skeptical, to be honest, but there is at least a hint, and I think it would require a follow-up. But I mean, I also have to say these training studies, they're quite demanding in terms of resources and time, and well, depends a bit on whether we do get funding to do another one or not.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Dr. Day has a question, please.
Yeah, so let's say a commentary here regarding induced synesthesia as opposed to congenital synesthesia. One thing about the difference there is that, okay, say if you're looking at a congenital synesthete, say with like to take the most familiar type of thing with grapheme synesthesia, so the congenital synesthete has had that since he or she was 5 or 6 years old. If you induce synesthesia in a research subject at the age of 36 or so, okay, so I'd say there you go. But this goes on back to something that Mikhail Haverkamp brought up, and also brought up other places, the familiarity, right? Say previous experience, right? The congenital synesthete has 30, you say the congenital synesthete at the age of 36 has 30 years worth of experience. They can look back at their experience when they were 6 years old. They can look back at their experience when they were 16, at 26. They have familiarity. For the 36-year-old congenital synesthete, the experience of synesthesia is quotidian. It's mundane. Right? So it's gets on back to the question of qualitative difference. There's part of your qualitative difference. That past experience, the extent to which, to get on back to the question of boredom. For the 36-year-old congenital synesthete, I was like, seeing A once again as red, been there, done that. So, right, I would say, I'm wondering how this is factoring into things.
Well, I totally agree. I cannot anything else. And I mean, it very much relates also to the observation that if training is discontinued and we test our participants 3 months later, they don't report any phenomenological experiences anymore. But still, they show the automatic associations in terms of a synesthetic Stroop effect. So I think something is still retained. But then I would also say, if we wait for maybe another year or so, maybe even the Stroop effect would disappear if we don't continue with the training. So it really seems to be, let's say, if we oversimplify this a little bit, let's say the brain is in one state, we can shift it to another state, but if you discontinue with the training, it goes back to what it has experienced for the entire life. It's probably an oversimplification, but it's probably the most simple explanation for that.
And this might get on back to the matter of familiarity. You can move it, but then you're going on back to what you're more familiar with because of your past experience.
I totally agree. I have nothing to add.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry, we're running out of time. There is maybe just time for one very brief question. Chloe, do you have a question? Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, I don't know if the sound is correct. Do you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear
Yes.
you. Yeah.
I wonder if we know there are profiles similar to those described for synesthetes in people, for example, diagnosed as having high intellectual potential or autistic disorders. I mean, people with different sensory or emotional processing particularities.
I didn't understand the very last part of the question, the last few words, I'm sorry.
Yeah, my question was that do we know if there are profiles similar to those described for synesthetes in people diagnosed as having, for example, high intellectual potential or autistic disorders? I mean, more generally, the people with different sensory or emotional processing particularities that we can find, for example, in synesthete. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I guess it's a difficult question to answer. I mean, there is some evidence with regards that synesthesia and autism seems to co-occur to some extent. But then, I mean, synesthesia, the prevalence of synesthesia is quite low, and the prevalence of autism is also quite low. So that then you get a large enough sample in order to make these conclusions, I think is very difficult. On the other hand, I mean, what we found is, for instance, with people who engage with colors on a daily basis, they do seem to share a similar visual perceptual profile or a similar profile for memory related to color information. Well, I guess that's probably only part of an explanation with regards to high cognitive potential. I cannot say anything, I'm sorry. Simply because there are no
thank
studies.
you very much. Thank you.
Okay, let's gracefully wrap this talk up. On behalf of the audience and ourselves, I would like to thank Leighton, Nicholas, and Mikhail for this most insightful talks about how our senses work together and how this, well, can be harnessed to understand and produce effects in design and generally in human perception. So, well, next time we'll have something no less thrilling for you, because in our next seminar we're going to read the minds of synesthetes in big literature. And our guest speakers will be UK-based fiction writer and synesthete Jane Yardley, American literary scholar and synesthesia researcher Patricia Lynn Duffy, and Dr. Bodo Winter, an associate professor in cognitive linguistics, University of Birmingham. So save the date, it's the 8th of November, and we appreciate your curiosity and engagement in this seminar. So the world of synesthesia, when words become flavors, colors turns into melodies, and ideas become experiences. So we welcome you next time. Thank you very much, and join us. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank